Hi class, and welcome to chapter 7. This chapter will be all about photosynthesis, and it's the last chapter before our next lecture exam, so it's the end of this module. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about biofuels being an energy source obtained from living material. We're going to talk about how when we derive energy from biofuels, we're tapping into the energy of the sun, and then we're going to relate this to living cells. So the same solar energy is converted to chemical energy of sugar through the process of photosynthesis. And this chapter will focus all about how photosynthesis works. Photosynthesis is a very important process for how our plants grow, for what we eat. It'll take in carbon dioxide energy from the sun and create glucose or plant material and also give off oxygen. So here are the big ideas. We're going to look at an intro to photosynthesis. We'll talk about what the Calvin cycle means. We'll look at light reactions, how they are converting solar energy to chemical energy, and we'll look at the global significance of photosynthesis. So an introduction to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis powers most of life on Earth. Plants, algae, and some photosynthetic protists and bacteria are photoautotropes, meaning that they produce food consumed by heterotrophic organisms. And a heterotroph is any consumer that feeds on plants or animals or decomposes organic material. What do self-feeding photoautotrophs require from the environment to make their own food? And we'll talk about what they need. So here's just a look at different types of plants that are using photosynthesis, energy from the sun, as well as carbon dioxide to create their plant material, which is what other animals will feed on. So here's one example of some ferns, some sea kelp in the oceans, and then some protists. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts in plant cells, and the chloroplasts are surrounded by a double membrane and contain stacks of what we call Phycoloids and a thick fluid called stroma. Chlorophyll itself is a light-absorbing pigment in the chloroplast that plays a central role in converting solar energy to chemical energy. And how do the reactant molecules of photosynthesis reach the chloroplasts in the leaves? They will travel through and enter the leaves from the sun. So here we have a look at a leaf and how it's broken into the cross section. Here's the mesophyll and then the cell. And then within that cell, you see kind of these green circles. And these are the chloroplasts within those green circles that contain what we call the phycoloids and the stroma surrounding them. So these are the chloroplast cells where photosynthesis will occur, and they are what give plants their green color. And here's just a more in-depth look at those. So you can see here how the carbon dioxide enters the leaf and how oxygen leaves through the stroma, the holes on the leaf, the little pores. And here's a zoomed in look at the chloroplast itself, and you can see those phycoloids a little bit better. Here's a look at the chloroplast within a mesophyll cell. You can see how it has an oval shape and a green color to it. And the chloroplast here with the granium describes those phycoloid pieces, and the stroma describes the area around them. So scientists traced the process of photosynthesis using isotopes. So they did experiments using both heavy and radioactive isotopes that helped them to determine all the details of the process of photosynthesis. They used a heavy isotope of oxygen, O18. Remember, isotope just means it has different numbers of neutrons. Scientists were able to follow the fate of oxygen atoms during photosynthesis, and the results were that plants actually produce oxygen containing this oxygen 18 isotope only when supplied with labeled water, never when provided with labeled carbon dioxide. So here's the experiment that scientists used to trace the process of photosynthesis. So they traced the process of oxygen. And here's experiment 1 and experiment 2. And when they traced it on the hydrogen, the water molecules, they were able to find that oxygen that came through as the oxygen, whereas the carbon dioxide oxygen remained in the sugar molecule. So I hope that makes sense here. So these are the equations of photosynthesis. CO2 plus H2O is equal to glucose, which is this structure, water, and oxygen. And when they labeled the oxygen on the carbon dioxide, they found that that oxygen ended up with the sugar molecule. And when they labeled the oxygen in the water molecule, they found that that oxygen, after the reaction took place, ended up in the oxygen that the plant not exhales, but the plant produces out of its leaf. So here's a look at just a basic kind of chemical equation for photosynthesis. Plants will take in light energy from the sun. They'll take in carbon dioxide as well as water. And from that, they produce glucose, this 6-carbon-like molecule, as well as oxygen gas. So plants take in the carbon dioxide that we exhale, and in return, they give us glucose, or plant material that other animals can eat, as well as oxygen gas that we can breathe back in. So here's just an example of a plant. You can see here that it needs water from this equation. So this plant is taking in water through its leaves. Photosynthesis, like respiration, is what we call a redox reaction, which is an oxidation reduction process. And in photosynthesis, water is oxidized and carbon dioxide is reduced. Cellular respiration uses these redox reactions to harvest the chemical energy stored in a glucose molecule. So here's a look again at photosynthesis. We see here that carbon dioxide becomes reduced, meaning it gets changed. The oxygens in carbon dioxide get reduced to glucose molecule, and the water becomes oxidized to oxygen. The light reactions occur on the inside of the Phycoloids and those chloroplasts, producing ATP and NADPH for what we call the Calvin cycle, which takes place in the stroma. And during the Calvin cycle, carbon dioxide will be incorporated into organic compounds in a process called carbon fixation. So again, we have the process of photosynthesis, which you will hopefully get really familiar with. The lab for this week also goes with photosynthesis, so hopefully the two will be hand in hand helpful. All right, so here's just another look at what happens within these chloroplasts of a plant cell. So water comes into the chloroplasts, energy from the sun. They travel into these thiocoloids where these light reactions occur, and out comes oxygen, as well as sugar, which will, how we create the sugar is the NADPH and the ATP produced from the light reactions will go and enter into the Calvin cycle in the stroma. And within the stroma, which again is the area outside of these green thiocoloids in the chloroplasts, within the stroma, this is where the Calvin cycle occurs, and the Calvin cycle is what will produce the sugar. So the light reactions converting solar energy to chemical energy. Sunlight is a type of energy called electromagnetic energy or radiation, and certain wavelengths of visible light are absorbed by chlorophyll and other pigments. Carotenoids also function in photoprotection from excessive light. And here's just a look at the light rays of visible light on the visible light spectrum. So on the light spectrum of light rays, the visible lights we see have wavelengths of about 380 to 750. And again, here are the light rays that will enter into the chloroplasts. Some will be reflected, others absorbed, and some will be transmitted through, as shown here on that leaf. The thiocoloid membranes contain photosystems, each consisting of a light harvesting complex and a reaction center complex. A primary electron acceptor will receive photoexcited electrons from the reaction center chlorophyll. And that is shown here. So electrons are received into the chlorophyll molecule. And this is just showing how electrons can, when they're absorbed, change the color of a substance or create kind of a fluorescent state to it. So here shows the photosystem of the thiocoloid membrane. The stroma surrounds it, and this just shows how the special pair of chlorophyll molecules will take the light, send it to the reaction complex so that the light harvesting complexes can occur. So again, this is how your chloroplasts will absorb the light that is needed to create photosynthesis. And here's a great animation explaining light and pigments. Electrons also shuttle from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1, providing the energy to make ATP and then reducing NADP to NADPH. And photosystem 2 regains electrons as water is split and oxygen is released. So we have these two photosystems pretty much, and they both work. You don't have to know all the details of this, but the two photosystems just work to take in light, use photons to create ATP. In photophosphorylation, the electron transport chain pumps hydrogen into the thiolaccolid space, and the concentration gradient drives hydrogen back through ATP synthase, which powers the synthesis of ATP. And that's shown here. So we're creating a concentration gradient by pumping hydrogen ions into this space. And when the hydrogen ions then get transported through the ATP synthase, a lot of ATP is created that will go to the Calvin cycle to help create sugar. And this kind of takes you through the steps that we just talked about. The Calvin cycle then reduces carbon dioxide to sugar. So the steps in the Calvin cycle include carbon fixation, reduction, release of a substance called G3P, and regeneration of a substance called RUBP. What the Calvin cycle does is it uses carbon from carbon dioxide, electrons from NADPH, and energy from ATP to construct G3P, which is used to build glucose and other organic molecules. So this is a look at the Calvin cycle. I won't ask you guys to know the details of it. All I want you to know is that the Calvin cycle takes in carbon dioxide, and at the end, it creates glucose from it. So again, this is a great slide to review because this is what's happening inside the chloroplast. Light and water comes into the thiaccolid to create oxygen, and then the NADPH and ATP produced from that go into the Calvin cycle to create sugar. Here's a look at the Calvin cycle. Again, it takes in carbon dioxide and creates sugar at the end. And I won't ask you guys to know all the detailed steps of the Calvin cycle. In C3 plants, a drop in carbon dioxide and rise in oxygen when the stromatoclose divert the Calvin cycle to photorespiration. And C4 plants and CAM plants first fix carbon dioxide into a 4-carbon compound that provides carbon dioxide to the Calvin cycle, even when the stromata close on hot, dry days. So here's just a look at the difference between sugarcane and pineapple and how different plants will use and fixate their carbon dioxide to create sugar. The sugarcane and the pineapple. So the global significance of photosynthesis is very important. Cellular respiration in the mitochondria of plant cells uses about 50% of the carbohydrates made by photosynthesis. And sugars also serve as a starting material for making other organic molecules, such as proteins and lipids. Glucose molecules are linked together to make cellulose, which is the main component of cell walls. So that's why when we say plants are making glucose to be eaten, it's because they're making their own plant walls. They're growing themselves so that other animals can eat them. I'll let you agree or disagree with this statement. No process is more important to the welfare of life on Earth than photosynthesis. And there's lots of arguments that would agree with this because your plants are creating the first kind of basis of the food pyramid that all animals will build upon, as well as cleaning our air by taking carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. So here we take a look at plants again. They take in sun energy, water, carbon dioxide to create oxygen and also sugar. So plants are incredibly important to life as we know it on this earth. Scientists have studied the effects of rising carbon dioxide levels using laboratory growth chambers and field studies. And long-term field projects enable scientists to assess the effects of carbon dioxide levels on natural ecosystems. So here's how scientists, there's a monitoring central tower with carbon dioxide releasing surrounding it. So they're able to monitor the effects of carbon dioxide and increasing levels and how plants could potentially lower those levels. So here's a look at the control of plots and elevated carbon dioxide plots in the plant dry biomass. So this just shows how the control plants differ from elevated carbon dioxide dry plots of Earth, just to show how the increase in carbon dioxide leads to usually an increase of plant matter. And that's because the plants can take the carbon dioxide out of the air and then create sugar or their plant walls from it. Carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere create what we call the greenhouse effect. And global warming is a major aspect of climate change, which is a long-term directional change to the global climate that lasts for 3 decades or more. And an international agreement reached at the Paris Climate Conference of 2015 seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit global warming. So I'll let you guys explain the greenhouse effect in your own words. And this is a great picture of the greenhouse effect. We have solar radiation warming the planet. Some heat energy escapes into space, but some heat is absorbed by the greenhouse gases, which are radiated back to Earth. So by now you should be able to use these as your checkpoint slides. Again, at the end of all these chapters, there's some great drawings to kind of fill in. And I think I've told you before, I will probably use some of these in your test that will be due this Sunday. Thanks for listening, guys.